He brushed it off like it was nothing. Canada doesn't matter. The trade deal doesn't matter. Canadian-made cars don't matter. That's what Donald Trump said, casually, almost dismissively. And then, almost at the same moment, Canada's industry minister was standing in Beijing, looking straight at the world and warning about instability coming from the United States. That contrast wasn't random. It wasn't coincidence. It was deliberate. And if you listen closely to what was said today, and where it was said, you start to realize this wasn't just another diplomatic trip. This was Canada signaling that something fundamental is changing.
This is a new year, and we're now in a new era of partnership with China. And so it was important for us and the Prime Minister to come as this first visit to Beijing, and meeting obviously with Premier Li and tomorrow with President Xi. We've seen since the beginning of the year, there's lots of disruptions around the world. Maybe Venezuela, maybe Iran, maybe obviously a lot of unpredictability south of our border. But we've said it many times, and we continue to say it. There are a lot of things that we cannot control, but there are lots of things we can control. And we'll focus on what we can control. And who we do business with is something we can control. And that's exactly what markets and that's exactly what businesses are looking for. Stability, reliability.
Let's start with the moment most people are going to overlook. Standing in Beijing, Melanie Joly didn't talk about ceremony. She didn't talk about handshakes or photo ops. She talked about unpredictability. She talked about disruption. And she made it very clear that one of the biggest sources of that disruption right now is south of Canada's border. She didn't say Donald Trump's name, but she didn't need to. Everyone listening knew exactly who she was talking about. She talked about a world where Venezuela, Iran, and other global flashpoints are already creating instability. And then she added something that landed differently. She talked about unpredictability coming from the United States. In my view, that was one of the clearest public rebukes of Trump-era trade behavior we've seen from a Canadian official on foreign soil. Here's why that matters. This wasn't said quietly in Ottawa. It wasn't whispered behind closed doors. It was said out loud in Beijing, while Canada was actively demonstrating that it has other options. That's not an accident. That's messaging.
China is the third biggest investor in Canada with $50 billion invested in 2024, but also China is our second biggest client in the world because it is our second biggest market where we export. And so, as we continue these conversations, and as of course there's important diplomatic engagement, we want to make sure that this makes sense to Canadians, for Canadians, that this creates good jobs back home, that while a lot of workers are asking themselves, how can they continue to have a good job? And while anxiety is high, we think that coming here will create much more certainty, and we can continue to work on stability and therefore prosperity for Canadians.
And global audiences understand messaging like this instantly. Joly framed it around control. She said there are many things Canada can't control in the world right now, but who Canada does business with is something it absolutely can control. That line wasn't meant for domestic politics alone. It was meant for markets, investors, and governments watching closely. Stability, reliability. Those were the words she emphasized, and that's not subtle. Now here's where things get interesting. This wasn't just talk. The substance of the visit backed it up immediately. Mark Carney's first day in Beijing wasn't light. It wasn't symbolic. It was dense, deliberate, and packed with action. He met with Chinese Premier Li Qiang. He was received with a formal guard of honor, and by the end of day one, 8 memorandums of understanding had already been signed. 8 on day one. And these weren't vague statements about future cooperation. These were practical agreements covering energy cooperation, forestry and modern wood construction, food safety, crime prevention, tourism, and cultural exchange. These are sectors that translate directly into jobs, supply chains, and long-term planning. China doesn't move this quickly unless it sees serious value and serious commitment on the other side. This is the part most people misunderstand. China isn't doing Canada a favor here. And Canada isn't suddenly pivoting out of desperation. What's happening is that both sides see an opportunity created by uncertainty elsewhere. From China's perspective, Canada looks stable, predictable, and rule-based, especially compared to an American political environment where tariffs, threats, and reversals can happen overnight depending on who's posting on social media. And that perception matters more than any headline. Jolie also laid out numbers that give this trip real weight. China is Canada's third largest investor, with roughly $50 billion invested as of 2024. It's also Canada's second largest export market. That means this relationship isn't theoretical. It already supports real jobs, real industries, and real communities back home. She tied it directly to anxiety among workers, people worried about their livelihoods, farmers under pressure, auto workers watching every statement coming out of Washington and wondering what it means for their future. Her message was simple but powerful. This visit is about creating certainty for Canadians in a world that feels increasingly uncertain. That's where the tension really comes from. Because while Canada was talking about stability in Beijing, Donald Trump was doing what he always does, minimizing, dismissing, and framing Canada as expendable. In my view, that contrast is doing more damage to American leverage than Trump realizes. When you tell a partner they don't matter, you shouldn't be surprised when they start acting like they believe you. And then we get to the part that has Washington nervous. Canola and cars. When Jolie addressed questions about canola, she didn't shut anything down. She signaled expectations. After months of pressure on Canadian farmers due to Chinese restrictions, Canada is clearly expecting movement, real movement, coming out of this visit. And tomorrow's meeting between Mark Carney and President Xi is where that pressure could finally turn into results. But autos are the bigger story. This is where things escalate beyond trade disputes and into long-term strategy. Jolie openly acknowledged how worried auto workers are right now, especially after hearing repeated threats from Trump about Canada's ability to export cars into the U.S. market. She talked about the scale of the sector, 125,000 direct jobs, roughly 400,000 when you include indirect employment. That's not something any Canadian government can afford to gamble with. So Canada is doing what countries do when they feel boxed in. It's building options. She confirmed her team is working on a new auto strategy designed to favor production in Canada. Not just survival, growth. And she made a point of saying Canada is actively talking to partners, not just in the US, but in Korea, Germany, and elsewhere around the world. And then came the line that quietly changed the entire conversation. Chinese electric vehicles, not just imports, manufacturing. From the reactions I've seen, this is the part that sent shockwaves through trade watchers. There is growing expectation, both in Beijing and increasingly in Ottawa, that Chinese EV companies are looking seriously at setting up production in Ontario. Plants, supply chains, long-term industrial presence. If that happens, it's not incremental, it's transformational. Think about what that means. Tens of thousands of jobs, a secure foothold in the EV future, reduced vulnerability to U.S. auto threats, and Chinese-made or Chinese-designed EVs built in Canada, sitting right on the U.S. border, competitive on price, advanced technologically, exactly the scenario Trump has been trying to prevent. That's why his reaction today mattered. Because this isn't abstract anymore. Canada isn't bluffing, it's laying groundwork. And tomorrow's meeting with President Xi could confirm whether those expectations turn into commitments. When asked directly about tariffs and potential breakthroughs, Jolie didn't deny anything. She emphasized negotiations are ongoing and repeatedly pointed to tomorrow. That's diplomatic language, but it's also signaling. Governments don't talk like that unless something real is on the table. Here's the twist most people won't catch. Today wasn't important because of speeches or ceremonies. It mattered because lines were crossed. Canada didn't just visit China. It demonstrated in full view of the world that it has alternatives, economic, strategic, and political ones. 8 MOUs on day one isn't routine, it's acceleration. It's China moving fast because it sees reliability and long-term value. At the same time, a Canadian minister stood on Chinese soil and openly described instability coming from the United States. That combination sends a message not just to Washington, but to investors, allies, and global markets. Canada is no longer organizing its future around Donald Trump's moods. This isn't about choosing China over the United States, despite how some people will try to frame it. That framing is outdated and, frankly, misleading. What Canada is doing is ending vulnerability. For years, Trump's leverage worked because Canada had limited room to maneuver. Auto threats worked, tariffs worked, pressure worked. That era is ending. A country with options negotiates differently. It doesn't flinch at threats. It doesn't panic when a partner lashes out. Mark Carney is building those options deliberately. Europe, Asia, China. Not to provoke, but to protect. And once that shift happens, it doesn't quietly reverse. Trump can still shout. He can still dismiss. But leverage weakens every time Canada proves it can move forward without him. That's the shift unfolding right now. Trump can say, Canada doesn't matter. Today told a very different story. A Canadian Prime Minister welcomed with honor in Beijing. A foreign minister openly calling out instability from the United States. And a set of decisions that could permanently reshape Canada's economic future. Tomorrow could bring announcements on EVs, on canola, and on Canada's place in the global economy that change the game entirely. And if that happens, this won't be remembered as just another visit. It'll be remembered as the moment Canada stopped being boxed in. Once leverage shifts, it rarely shifts back quietly, and Donald Trump knows it. If you found this helpful, consider subscribing. I appreciate you.